The ongoing violence in the Middle East and the drone wars the U.S. is engaged in Pakistan and Afghanistan is a narrative that gets packaged in the news as something that's unchanging and sadly expected. Human lives are lost because of various levels of brutality, but that story often gets siloed into categories, and it happens to those people or them. It reminds me a little bit of what political philosopher Hannah Arendt once wrote in her book, Origins of Totalitarianism. The quote is, "What totalitarian ideologies aim is not the transformation of the outside world, but the transformation of human nature itself, by creating a society in which the banality of homo homini lupus is consistently realized." And she uses that Latin phrase to mean man's inhumanity to man. And you can just watch any episode of The Walking Dead to see that. Hi, I'm Ted Asregadoo. This is Truthout Interviews. And on the show today is Rania Khalek. She is a writer for Truthout, among a number of other publications. And she's here to discuss a number of articles that she has written on Truthout, on Israel, the drone wars, the NSA. And I welcome her to the program. Hello, Rania.
Hi, Ted. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. I want to start with Israel and the Palestinian conflict. You had a chance to interview Max Blumenthal, who is a journalist and has written a book about Israel. And it was a really kind of a riveting interview, really quite good. You asked him about a number of things, and I definitely want to read this book after reading your interview with him. But one thing that struck me and something that stuck out in the interview was a question that you asked about Nakba Day and how it has similarities to the Native American displacement here in the United States. Many people may not know what this day is in the Palestinian lives. Maybe you could explain that and how you saw a similarity between that event and the displacement of Native Americans in the U.S.
Well, Max's book, which is Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel, is amazing. It's probably, one of the first that's ever really gone. Max spent like 4 or 5 years or something along those lines, just coming in and out of Israel and the Palestinian territory and sort of immersing himself in the culture there and amongst the people there. And one thing that he talks about in the book, among many others, is sort of the Israeli Knesset, which is kind of which is their lawmaking body, how all these Israeli politicians are always trying to make these laws to basically criminalize any sort of commemoration of the Nakba, particularly on the Nakba Day. And the Nakba for Palestinians it means catastrophe, and it marks the day in 1948 when Israel declared independence. Israelis celebrated their Day of Independence, but it also marks the ethnic cleansing of some 750,000 Palestinians in the territory that's now considered Israel. A lot of Palestinian villages were literally cleansed. A lot of people were massacred. It's really a traumatic event for Palestinians. And so commemorating this day is a threat to Israel because it basically acknowledges that that Israel was built on top of another people's homeland. And so I just found it really striking, the similarities. It just reminded me of American history. And throughout American history, with the genocide committed against Native Americans and the continued displacement, and even till this day, Native Americans are concentrated in various reservations and are still sort of struggling. In Max's book is just filled with just really horrific instances that are just so familiar to really awful portions of U.S. history. Not just with Native Americans, but also with the Jim Crow South and the way that African Americans were treated. Max describes like a lynching in his book, where a mob of Jewish youth almost basically beat this young Palestinian boy nearly to death, and nobody stopped to help. It was in a very populated area where there was a lot of shops. And I really think that if Americans knew that there was segregation, openly, there was open racism, and if Americans knew the way that Israel functions, I really think that they would be horrified.
He talked a little bit in your interview that for a lot of American Jews here in the United States, they look at Israel through sort of rose-colored glasses, like it's this great democratic state, where nothing bad really ever happens, and they have legitimate right to exist based on the way in which the country came into existence. And the masking, the papering over, the ignorance of the daily brutalities that go on within the Palestinian territories by the Israelis, and the way in which even Israeli young children are sort of conditioned to constantly look at Arabs and as the enemy, as those people who are trying to kill us.
And just to clarify, I mean, most of Max's book takes place inside Israel, and that's one of the things that's really shocking because I mean, a lot of people sort of they have a lot of, especially progressives, at least think they have an understanding of, in the Palestinian territories under occupation, it's really horrific. But no, this is a lot of this takes place inside Israel. Inside the Green Line, where there are Arabs, there are Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel that are treated, differently. What we have seen is a lot of liberal Zionists in the U.S. are just freaking out about his book because it terrifies them. I mean, because a lot of liberal Zionists in the U.S. like they're liberal because they embrace multiculturalism in the United States. They embrace equality. And then when it comes to Israel, they embrace these segregationist policies of separation and of ethnic supremacy. And so Max's book really just highlights the country that they're embracing, and it scares them because it's like that sort of cognitive dissonance. It forces them to look at what they're actually supporting. And they're throwing temper tantrums over it.
Well, like I was saying earlier, he characterizes not just American Jews, but certainly those who are progressive or just describe themselves as liberals, but have an unquestioning support of Israel, as looking as Israel as a country with rose-colored glasses on. They don't see what he is reporting from inside the country, the culture that gives rise to this kind of violence and justifying it through the lens of the Holocaust. That if we don't do this, meaning that if we're not somewhat repressive and brutal, that the Arabs are going to come back or the Palestinians are going to come back and they're going to implement a final solution on us. So it's kill or be killed. Again, we go back to that quote from Hannah Arendt, which is Homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man. You had another article which was on the NSA, and it's been framed in the media as a largely white movement, meaning it was made up of people who are very angry that comes from white middle class or upper class enclaves within the country. But you talk about how surveillance in the United States was built on the spying of communities of color. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the NSA and its Dragnet surveillance program that we've all been learning about for the past few months because of Edward Snowden's leaks. There is some truth to the fact that, yes, there are a number of people who are now against the NSA and against this mass surveillance who do come from white, privileged, middle and upper class backgrounds. And I think that's because this is probably the first time when surveillance has affected those people, because this is a system that really is watching all of us. Now, what's important to understand, and what I talk about in my article, is that, spying and surveillance is a tactic that has historically been used to intimidate and suppress activism from communities of color and from basically marginalized communities. Poor Black communities in the 60s and 70s with the treatment of the Black Panthers and COINTELPRO. I mean, and even, Native Americans and Muslim community not that long ago was, the entire country was supportive of spying on the Muslim community because of the way that, they are related in the Muslim community in this country is equated with terrorism. So the point I was trying to make is that this is not a white movement. This is a movement where there are certainly white people and there are some strands of, libertarian, right-leaning people who care about civil liberties. And so they're also protesting the NSA. It's false to present it as an exclusively white movement as the media has done, when there are plenty of people of color, plenty of organizations that are led by people of color who are involved in the movement against mass surveillance, because they know more than anyone else how dangerous surveillance can be. There's also this tendency among Obama supporters who just kind of blindly support whatever the president does because they're hardcore Democrats and they like this president, who have also portrayed this movement as dominated by exclusively white people and have used that as an excuse to sort of to not be a part of it. I've noticed a lot of sort of people of color who are Democrats doing this and trying to make this movement seem as though it's a racist movement, like it only cares about NSA because it's President Obama, a black president, who's doing this. And I think that that's also false. And it's a really warped logic because regardless of who's in power, this program is going to continue unless we put a stop to it. And I mean, it's just really amazing to me to see people who care so much about stop and frisk, right? Who care so much about surveillance of communities of color, Muslim communities, all of a sudden be so for NSA spying just because of the man who's in charge of it at the moment.
Sort of the obverse of when George W. Bush was in office and the Patriot Act was implemented, and those who were, Tea Party libertarians, although they didn't exist then, but if they thought that way, they certainly didn't have any problem with the government creating a very, very invasive homeland security and also data mining back then. But now that sort of the tables have flipped, and now that you have President Obama as the executive in charge, that people on the Democratic side or the left-leaning side are more apt to forgive him for this than they would George W. Bush.
And on top of that, I think it's also really important to understand, especially for people of color who may have some sort of feeling of support for the NSA program, is who do you think it's going to be used against? I mean, yeah, it's Dragnet surveillance and it watches all of us, right? Watches all of our online activity. But when it comes down to it, the system of control in this country is very racially oriented. So it's going to just be another tool to target and surveil communities of color. Even now, say you trust Obama with these ridiculously expanded powers. What happens when you've got like a President Ted Cruz in power? I think those are questions and things that people really need to think about.
And I think that those are similar questions that people were discussing back in the time that the Patriot Act was passed in the early 2000s. Is that, well, the Republicans that are supporting it now wait till a Democrat gets in and uses the exact same tools to surveil you, to put you under surveillance. How are you going to feel about that? Well, I guess the Republicans at the time felt like, oh no, we're gonna own this joint for the next 2 decades. So don't worry about that. Yeah. Now on to the last question I have is about drone strikes. Innocent people have died because of these strikes, and the coverage in the media has either been minimal or it's been similar in that people don't notice it. It doesn't become a big news story because it sounded very similar to the previous one that was about a drone strike. So you spotlight a family who came to the United States to testify at a hearing about the loss of innocent life and the fact that the U.S. hasn't paid any kind of damages to families who have lost innocent lives. That was one of the things that struck out, that sort of stood out in your piece, was a thing that Code Pink had discovered, that there's a fund. It's not a lot of money, I guess, in the scope of things. It's about $40 million, but none of that money has really gone to any of the families. Is that correct?
Yeah. So this is specifically a fund that every year over the past 4 years had allocated. The Congress had allocated $10 million to this fund for Pakistani drone victims. And the family who came to speak to Congress that I wrote about, the Rahman family, it comes from North Waziristan, which is the area of Pakistan that's been hardest hit by drone strikes of all the areas that have been hit in the drone war. And they certainly haven't received compensation, but neither have any of the other drone victims. A lot of this money has gone to NGOs and that have nothing to do with helping drone victims. So yeah, no, not a single Pakistani drone victim has seen a dime of this money.
But to be fair, the family that you did spotlight, they didn't come to Washington, D.C. to collect money. They came to spotlight the problem.
Yeah, they certainly didn't. So this family that came to speak was a father, actually a Pakistani school teacher named Rafiq ur Rahman, and two of his children, Nabila, who was 9, and Zubair, who's 13. And they came to tell Congress about the drone strike that killed Rafiq's mother and their grandmother last year. She was 67 years old, and she was outside picking vegetables in the family garden, and she was she was being helped by several of her grandchildren, and she was killed by a drone strike. And this was before they saw this happen. This happened right before their eyes. You talked a little bit about media coverage and how it sort of desensitizes us to what happens in drone strikes, and a lot of that has to do with in the aftermath of drone strikes. The immediate claims made by intelligence officials, whether they're Pakistani or American intelligence officials, is that we killed X number of militants. And so that's not the case, though. A lot of these cases, we're killing civilians. And that's not to say it's on purpose, but the way that we do drone strikes, the policy is that any young man within the of a military age in the vicinity of a drone strike will be counted as a militant if they're killed. That's the Obama administration's policy. So they say that they're not killing civilians. The civilian casualty is very low, but I think that the Rahman family talking directly at Congress about this really helped unravel that sort of propaganda narrative. And there was a couple human rights reports that came out a couple weeks ago that actually showed that found that up to 900 civilians have been killed in Pakistan in U.S. drone strikes since 2004. So this program that we talk about, that's supposedly keeping us safe and killing all these militants, mind you, suspected militants without any due process of law whatsoever, without a trial, is terrorizing innocent people like Zubair and Nabila. And so that's one of the reasons it was such a powerful event. This is the first time drone victims had ever addressed Congress directly about a drone strike that's killed civilians. And I mean, it brought Congressman Alan Grayson, who actually organized the event. It brought him to tears and several other people in the room. I mean, I think this is something that should be done on a regular basis. And I wish the media, instead of spending time trumpeting and quoting the unverified claims made by anonymous officials in the U.S. government about drone strikes, I wish instead that they would travel to these areas on the ground and speak with the victims. Because I don't think that Americans are necessarily that apathetic. I think that if, on the front page of newspapers, we had this regular occurrence of, this is the family that was killed in a drone strike last week, this is their story, I think people would be against this drone war.
I agree, and I think that a lot of the money constraints that media outlets are up against, I should say, prevents them from sending correspondents to get the real story. So they're like oh, go ahead, sorry.
I'm just talking. When I say media, I mean outlets. I mean the big ones who I know can afford to do that.
Like a 60 Minutes could afford to do something like that.
Right.
They could easily send Lara Logan over to Pakistan to get the story. But and I look at the way in which investigative journalism, whether it takes time, it takes money, it takes effort to get a story. And especially if you're doing a story in another part of the world where you have to spend a vast amount of resources, I think that news directors and those who are in charge of the money of allocating those resources, they look at what's cheaper. Just get a couple talking heads on TV to go at it and say, we'll leave it there, or actually spend the money and go out and get the story. And I'm sorry that it sounds so crass. I've been working in the media so long that maybe I've sort of internalized that. But then they say, well, what's the return on this investment? And then they have to be beholden to these people that invest, whether it's shareholders, whether it's their bosses or whatnot. And so it kind of feeds on itself. And that's the sad part about journalism nowadays. But outlets like Truthout and others that and the author that you interviewed, Max Blumenthal, they are journalists in that they are going to get the story. It's not a popularity contest. It's not to get on television and tout my book, but this is their life's work. This is about what they believe to be, whether it's an injustice or whether there's a story there that needs to be told, that they're going to spend the resources and do it because they're very committed to what they do. Just like a lot of people that contribute to Truthout, like yourself, are very committed to what you do, and you will go and get the story. So, we certainly applaud your efforts here on Truthout to do that, and that's why we like to spotlight the writers, to give them a platform, another platform, to talk a little bit more about the work that they're doing in a larger scope in some way.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me on to talk about this stuff. And I first appreciate Truthout and journalists like Max and people like Jeremy Scahill, who, you know, without the resources of the 60 Minutes and these big corporate media outlets are able to go on the ground in these really dangerous places and yeah, get us a story.
Rania Khalek, independent journalist living in the Washington, D.C. area, her work has appeared not only on Truthout, but on Alternet, to Common Dreams in These Times, and other publications. And we'll probably have her on another time soon. And that's it for Truthout interviews for another week. I'm Ted Asregadoo. We'll see you next time.